You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. My name is Thaddeus Vale, and I keep a ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age and stained with iron gore ink. The same kind they used in the old country, back when contracts meant something permanent. Each page holds a name, and each name represents a soul I've delivered to hell's custody. 99 entries fill that book, written in my own careful hand. The 100th name changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when I thought I understood the rules of life and death. I wasn't always a collector. Once upon a time, I was just a gravedigger, an embalmer down in Louisiana, working the night shift in St. Augustine Cemetery. It was honest work, if lonely, and I had a reputation for handling the difficult cases. The ones other funeral directors wouldn't touch. The suicides who came in with their necks twisted at impossible angles. The murder victims whose wounds wouldn't stop bleeding, no matter how much embalming fluid I pumped into their veins. The ones who died with unfinished business, clinging to them like morning fog on a grave marker. I'd been working the graveyard shift for 7 years when everything changed. 7 years of preparing bodies that whispered secrets in the dark. Of digging graves in soil that sometimes moved when no wind was blowing. Of learning that death isn't always the end of the story. The old-timers who worked the cemetery during the day used to tell me I had a gift. A way of calming the restless dead that came natural as breathing. They said it ran in families, this ability to speak to those caught between worlds. What they didn't tell me was that gifts like mine come with a price. My grandfather, Ezekiel Vale, had worked these same grounds back in the 1920s. The old-timers spoke of him in hushed tones, said he could make the angriest spirit settle down just by humming old hymns while he worked. They found him one morning in the Trosclair family crypt. Peaceful as you please, though he'd been dead for 3 days, and there wasn't a mark on him. The family said he'd been seeing things toward the end, talking to empty graves like they were holding conversations. Looking back, I wonder if he'd made his own bargain, years before I made mine. If this gift we Vales carried wasn't a blessing at all, but a generational debt coming due with interest. It was October of 1985 when I learned the cost. Hurricane season had been brutal that year, and the old mausoleum in Section 12 had been taking a beating for months. The Borugard family tomb, built in 1847 from limestone, quarried up in Arkansas, had been slowly sinking into the soft Louisiana soil for over a century. Every heavy rain left it listing a little more to the left, and every windstorm loosened more of the mortar holding those massive blocks in place. The city kept promising to shore up the foundation, but you know how these things go. Promises are cheap, especially when they're made to dead folks who can't vote. The Borugard family had died out in the 1960s, leaving no one to pay for proper maintenance, and the city budget had other priorities. I should have seen it coming. Should have noticed how the building groaned whenever I walked past it during my rounds. Should have paid attention to the way the groundskeepers started avoiding that section of the cemetery, making excuses about equipment problems whenever work needed doing near the old tomb. But I was distracted that night, focused on the body I was preparing for burial the next morning. Mrs. Evangeline Trosclair had passed at 93, outliving 3 husbands and most of her children, and she'd died peacefully in her sleep. Should have been a routine job, but Mrs. Trosclair had other ideas. Every time I tried to close her eyes, they'd spring open again, staring at me with an intensity that made my hands shake. Every time I positioned her hands across her chest in the traditional prayer pose, they'd slip down to her sides like she was trying to push something away. Her skin had a waxy quality that didn't respond properly to the embalming fluid, and no matter how much makeup I applied, her complexion remained the colour of old parchment. I was concentrating so hard on keeping her still that I almost missed the sound. A low, grinding noise like giant millstones turning against each other, coming from somewhere outside the preparation room. The sound started soft, barely audible, over the hum of the refrigeration units, but it grew steadily louder until it was drowning out everything else. By the time I looked up from my work, the sound had become a roar, and the whole building was shaking, like a dog trying to get dry. The overhead lights swayed on their chains, casting wild shadows across the walls, and I could hear glass breaking somewhere in the administrative offices. The collapse happened in stages, each one more catastrophic than the last. First, chunks of limestone began raining down on the roof of the funeral home, each impact like a cannon shot. The building's frame, already old and not designed to withstand that kind of punishment, began to buckle under the assault. I could hear the screaming of metal as support beams twisted and snapped, followed by the sound of roof tiles cascading to the ground like deadly hail. Then the real collapse began. Half the Borugard mausoleum, tons of carved stone that had stood for nearly a century and a half, came crashing through the ceiling in an avalanche of limestone and twisted iron. The noise was indescribable, like the world itself was coming apart at the seams. I dove under the embalming table just as a marble angel the size of a grown man punched through the roof and landed where I'd been standing. The impact sent Mrs. Trosclair's body sliding off the table and into the corner where she lay staring at me with those stubborn eyes that wouldn't stay closed. More blocks of limestone followed, each one bigger than the last, until the entire room had become a tomb with me trapped at its heart. When the noise finally stopped, I found myself pinned in a pocket of space no bigger than a coffin, with tons of carved stone pressing down from above. My left leg was caught beneath the marble angel, trapped at an angle that sent waves of agony through my hip and spine. I could feel warm blood pooling beneath me, soaking through my clothes and mixing with the embalming fluid that had spilled from broken containers when the table collapsed. The pain was extraordinary, like having my bones ground between millstones, but worse than that was the silence. The sudden absence of sound after such catastrophic noise was deafening. Even the crickets had gone quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The air in my tiny prison was thick with dust and the chemical smell of spilled preservatives. Each breath was a struggle, and I could feel my strength ebbing with every heartbeat. The weight pressing down from above was enormous, and I knew that even if rescue workers arrived immediately, they'd never be able to shift enough stone to reach me before I bled to death. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from somewhere in the rubble above me, steady and unhurried, like someone taking a casual stroll through a garden. Each step sent small cascades of dust and pebbles raining down through the gaps in the stone, and I could hear the soft whistle of someone humming an old hymn. Amazing Grace, played slow and mournful, the way they sing it at funerals when the grief is too heavy for anything but the simplest melodies. At first, I thought it might be a rescue worker who'd arrived faster than seemed possible, but there was something wrong with the sound of those footsteps, something that suggested the walker wasn't entirely human. They fell with perfect rhythm, never hesitating, never stumbling over the debris that should have made movement treacherous. A shadow fell across the narrow gap where a little moonlight had been filtering through, and then I saw him. Tall and lean, well dressed in an old-fashioned ways, wearing a grey Confederate officer's coat with brass buttons that caught what little light there was. His face was pale and aristocratic, with sharp cheekbones and a carefully trimmed goatee that made him look like a portrait from before the war between the states. When he smiled, his teeth were white as fresh tombstones, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that sees through everything and finds it all amusing. "Mr. Vale," he said, and his voice carried the honey-smooth drawl of old southern money, the kind of accent you hear in antebellum mansions where Spanish moss drapes the verandas and the ghosts of slaves still walk the halls. "You appear to be in quite the predicament." I tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet cough that tasted like copper pennies and grave dirt. Blood was filling my mouth, and I could feel my vision starting to grey around the edges. The stranger crouched down with fluid grace, bringing his face level with mine, and I could smell sulphur on his breath, faint but unmistakable, like matches struck in a closed room. "I can save you," he continued, pulling out a gold pocket watch and checking the time with casual interest. The watch face gleamed in the dim light, and I could see that, instead of numbers, it was marked with symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. But there would be a price naturally. Nothing in this world comes free, especially life itself. He leaned closer, and in the dim light I could see that his eyes were the colour of old brass, tarnished and dark around the edges. There was something hypnotic about them, something that made it difficult to look away even when every instinct screamed that I should. 100 souls, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 100 sinners who've managed to slip through hell's fingers, each one in need of proper guidance to their final destination. You have the gift for it, Mr. Vale. I've been watching your work for some time. The pain in my leg was becoming unbearable, and I could feel my life draining away with each laboured breath, but his words sparked something in my mind. A memory of the stories my grandfather's friends used to tell. Stories about bargains made in desperate moments, about prices paid in installments over decades. "What kind of souls?" I managed to whisper. His smile widened, revealing more of those perfect white teeth. The special cases. The ones who found loopholes in the cosmic contract, who've managed to avoid their appointments through cleverness, or corruption, or simple stubbornness. Each one a puzzle to be solved, a challenge worthy of your particular talents. He reached into his coat and withdrew a chain made of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The links were shaped like tiny skulls, each one carved with intricate detail, and they clicked together softly when he moved them. "This will be your tool," he said, letting the chain pull in his palm, "forged from meteorite iron that fell from the heavens in ages past, blessed by powers older than human civilization. When wrapped around a soul's vessel, it draws out what belongs to me with perfect efficiency. The meteorite iron. I'd heard of such things in the old stories, metal that came from beyond the earth and carried properties that defied natural law. Grandfather used to tell tales of swords forged from such material, weapons that could cut through more than flesh. "Do we have an understanding, Mr. Vale?" the stranger asked, extending his gloved hand toward me. "What would you have done?" Death was already reaching for me with cold fingers, and here was someone offering not just life, but purpose. I'd spent 7 years tending to the dead, learning their secrets, understanding their needs. This seemed like the natural next step, the progression from caring for souls after death to guiding them to where they belonged. I reached out with my free hand and grasped his. The touch burned like a brand, searing my palm with heat that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. But the moment our skin made contact, the pain in my leg vanished instantly, and I could feel strength flowing back into my limbs like water filling a dry well. The world shifted around me, reality bending in ways that my eyes couldn't quite process. When my vision cleared, I was standing in the cemetery parking lot, completely whole, watching fire trucks arrive to investigate reports of a collapsed mausoleum. My clothes were clean and pressed, my hands unmarked by the burning touch, and in my coat pocket was a leather-bound ledger that hadn't been there before. The first page contained detailed instructions written in elegant copperplate script, along with an address in Memphis and a name: William Carver, murderer and thief. At the bottom of the page, in the same flowing handwriting, was a simple phrase: "The collection begins at midnight." That was 40 years ago. Since then, I've travelled from coast to coast, following addresses written on scraps of parchment that appear in my coat pocket like morning dew. Each address leads to a soul that's managed to slip through hell's fingers, usually through some technicality or loophole in the cosmic bureaucracy that governs the afterlife. My job is simple in concept, complex in execution. Find them, bind them with a chain of meteorite iron, and deliver them to the nearest crossroads gate. But each soul is unique. Each one requires a different approach, and some fight harder than others. The chain itself is a marvel of infernal craftsmanship, black as midnight and cold to the touch, with links shaped like tiny skulls that seem to grin when the light hits them just right. When wrapped around someone's chest, it doesn't just bind their body, it draws their soul right out like pulling thread from a spindle. I keep it coiled in a leather pouch blessed by 3 different devils, and despite all the weight it's carried over the decades, it never seems to get any heavier. Over the years, I've learned that souls have different textures, different weights, different flavors. The soul of a murderer feels heavy and oily, like trying to hold mercury in your bare hands. It leaves a metallic taste in the air and makes the chain grow warm with absorbed malevolence. A thief's soul is light and slippery, always trying to escape through your fingers, leaving behind the faint scent of desperation and broken promises. The soul of a corrupt politician tastes like copper pennies and lies, while a fallen priest's soul burns cold as winter moonlight and carries the bitter flavour of betrayed trust. Each type requires different handling, different techniques for the binding, different routes to the crossroads gates where they're processed for final delivery. 99 souls I've collected over the years. Each one fought me in their own way, but the chain never failed. Some tried to run, leading me on chases across state lines that lasted for weeks. Others tried to bargain, offering me riches or power or secrets that would shake the foundations of the world. A few attempted to hide behind holy ground or protective wards, not understanding that the meteorite iron cuts through such defenses like they were made of paper. The most challenging was a voodoo priestess in New Orleans who'd been dead for 30 years but had anchored her soul to a network of possessed dolls scattered throughout the French Quarter. It took me 3 months to track down all 17 vessels and bind them simultaneously, and even then she'd nearly escaped by jumping into a tourist who happened to be walking past at the wrong moment. But I learned from each collection, refined my techniques, developed an instinct for reading souls that served me well as the cases grew more complex. By the time I reached my 90th collection, I was operating with the efficiency of a craftsman who'd perfected his trade. Then came number 100. The parchment appeared in my jacket pocket on a Sunday morning in March, while I was having coffee and chicory at a truck stop outside Baton Rouge. I'd just finished collecting my 99th soul, a fortune teller who'd been using real magic to curse her client's enemies for the right price. She'd put up quite a fight, summoning shadows that tried to rip the chain from my hands, and calling on spirits that whispered threats in languages I didn't recognize. But in the end, the meteorite iron had proven stronger than her borrowed power. I unfolded the new parchment carefully, expecting to see another street address in some forgotten corner of America. Instead, I found coordinates that led to a patch of Mississippi marshland, along with a name that made my blood run cold: Reverend Lucien Barrowe. I knew that name. Every soul collector worth his salt knows the story of Lucien Barrowe. He's legend among our kind. The one that got away. The soul that's been dancing just out of hell's reach for over a century. The uncollectible. In 1910, Barrowe had been a travelling evangelist who'd built himself quite a reputation for fiery sermons and miraculous healings throughout the Deep South. He was handsome in that dark, brooding way that made women fan themselves, and men question their faith with eyes like burning coals and a voice that could make sinners weep just by speaking their names. But Barrowe was more than just a charismatic preacher. He possessed genuine supernatural abilities, powers that he claimed came from God, but which those who knew better recognized as something far older and more dangerous. He could heal the sick with a touch, cast out demons with a word, and his sermons had the power to literally transform souls, burning away sin and replacing it with divine light. At least, that's what people believed. Barrowe had established a permanent church in the Mississippi Delta, right on top of what the locals knew to be an old Choctaw burial mound. Sacred ground blessed by blood and bones that predated Christ himself. The location wasn't chosen randomly. The burial mound sat at the intersection of 3 ley lines, creating a natural crossroads where the barriers between worlds were thin enough to allow passage for those who knew the proper rituals. The congregation grew quickly, drawn by Barrowe's promises of salvation and his talent for making the desperate feel chosen. He preached that the end times were coming, that only those pure enough to join his inner circle would be spared the coming fire. His revival meetings went on for months, with Barrowe preaching longer and more intense sermons each week, his voice growing hoarse from hours of shouting about damnation and deliverance. But something had been wrong from the very beginning. Locals reported strange dreams after attending his services, visions of burning angels and rivers of molten gold. Children who attended his Sunday school began speaking in tongues, but the words they spoke weren't from any earthly language. They were the syllables of hell itself, the secret names of demons whispered in innocent voices. Livestock in the area began dying mysteriously, found in perfect circles with no marks on their bodies, but their blood completely drained. Wells that had provided clean water for generations suddenly ran red, forcing families to move away or dig new sources miles from their homes. And through it all, Barrowe's congregation grew more devoted, more convinced that their preacher was leading them to glory. The truth, which only came to light decades later through careful investigation by agents of Hell's research division, was that Lucien Barrowe had never been human at all. He was a demon of considerable power who'd taken human form to conduct a massive harvesting operation, using the cover of religious revival to collect souls on an industrial scale. But Barrowe had made a critical error. He'd grown too fond of the role he was playing, too attached to the worship and adoration of his followers. Instead of delivering the souls he'd collected to Hell's custody as intended, he'd begun hoarding them, using their combined spiritual energy to increase his own power. The end came on the last Sunday in November, during what Barrowe called the Great Final Revival. He'd been preaching for 6 hours straight, his congregation hanging on every word as he described the paradise that awaited the faithful. When it came time for communion, he served wine that tasted sweeter than honey and bread that melted on the tongue like snow. 47 members of his congregation took communion that night. 47 souls drank the wine and ate the bread, and died believing they were ascending to heaven. The wine had been laced with strychnine, enough to kill a horse, but that wasn't what actually killed them. The poison was just a distraction, a way to mask the real cause of death while Barrowe performed the ritual that would bind their souls to his service. As each congregation member died, their soul was pulled directly into Barrowe's essence, adding their spiritual energy to his own growing power. By the time the last body hit the floor, the false preacher had absorbed enough divine energy to rival some of the lesser angels. Barrowe's own apparent death was staged, a performance designed to make Hell's agents believe he'd perished along with his victims. His body was found among the dead, clutching an empty bottle of the poisoned wine, his lips stained purple with the dregs. but those who examined the corpse carefully would have noticed that it was already beginning to decay in ways that suggested it had been dead for hours before the communion service even began. The church burned to the ground 3 days later, the fire started by agents sent to investigate reports of demonic activity in the area. They found evidence of the ritual circle Barrowe had used to bind the souls, along with artifacts that confirmed their worst suspicions about the true nature of the revival meetings. But they never found Barrowe himself. The local newspaper ran a small story about the tragedy, calling it a case of mass religious hysteria, and then the whole affair was quietly forgotten. The families of the dead were paid compensation by parties unknown, and the land where the church had stood was left to return to the swamp. But folks in those parts still tell stories about hearing church bells ringing at midnight on Sundays, even though the bell tower had been destroyed in the fire. Stories about seeing lights moving through the marsh where the church once stood, flickering like candle flames in the wind. Stories about voices singing hymns in languages that predate human speech. Over the decades, other collectors had tried to claim Barrowe's soul. Thomas Blackthorne, one of the most experienced agents in Hell's employment, had disappeared in those marshes in 1923, leaving only his boots and his soul chain-coiled on a rotting log. Maria Santos, a collector with over 200 successful captures to her credit, had gone looking for the false preacher in 1961 and returned 3 days later, speaking only in Latin phrases from the Book of Revelations. She'd spent the rest of her life in an asylum, drawing pictures of burning churches on every surface she could find. The walls of her room were covered with detailed sketches of the same scene, repeated hundreds of times. A church built from charred wood and bone, standing in a circle of fire, while souls writhed in the flames below. But I was different from the others who'd tried and failed. I had 40 years of experience with the difficult cases, the souls that required special handling. And I had something the others didn't, a perfect record and the complete trust of my employer. More importantly, I understood something about Barrowe that the other collectors had missed. He wasn't hiding from Hell's authority, he was competing with it. The rogue demon had established his own territory, his own power base, and he was using the souls he'd stolen to build something that could potentially rival Hell's infrastructure. That made him more than just a fugitive. It made him a threat to the entire cosmic order. I drove to Mississippi that same afternoon, following back roads that got narrower and more overgrown with each mile. The GPS on my phone lost signal somewhere around Yazoo City, and after that, I had to navigate by instinct and the occasional hand-painted sign, pointing toward settlements with names like Catfish Bend and Devil's Elbow. The coordinates led me deep into the delta, where cypress trees draped with Spanish moss stood knee-deep in black water that reflected the sky like a broken mirror. The air grew thicker as I drove deeper into the marshland, heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. It was the kind of place where time moved differently, where the past and present blurred together, like watercolors left in the rain. Alligators watched my truck pass from muddy banks, their eyes glowing like yellow lanterns in the gathering dusk. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows that seemed too large and too purposeful to be birds or squirrels, things that had been attracted by the spiritual energy radiating from Barrowe's sanctuary, drawn like moths to a flame that burned with stolen light. Eventually, I found the place the coordinates had led me to, a small island of higher ground connected to the main road by a causeway of rotting planks that looked like they'd been laid down sometime before the invention of proper engineering. The planks sagged under the weight of my truck, and I could hear water sloshing beneath them with each turn of the wheels. But it wasn't just water moving under those boards. As I drove across the causeway, I caught glimpses of shapes swimming in the murky depths below, things that were too large to be fish, and moved with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. The water itself had an oily quality that made me think of blood thinned with marsh mud, and it gave off a phosphorescent glow that intensified as I approached the island. The church stood at the centre of the island, like something from a fever dream, a structure that shouldn't have been able to exist according to any laws of physics or engineering I understood. It had been partially rebuilt using materials that defied logical explanation. The framework was constructed from charred timber that should have crumbled to ash decades ago, blackened beams that still held the scars of the fire that had consumed the original building. But instead of weakening the wood, the flames seemed to have hardened it, turning it into something more like stone than lumber. The gaps between the timbers had been filled with pieces of driftwood, weathered white by decades in the swamp, and the whole structure was held together by rusted iron straps that had been forged into shapes that resembled twisted human figures. Each strap told a story of agony and despair, faces contorted in silent screams, hands reaching out for salvation that would never come. The walls leaned at angles that defied logic, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. The building seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its geometry shifting depending on the angle from which it was viewed. From one side, it appeared to be a simple rural church. From another, it looked like a Gothic cathedral. From a third, it resembled a ziggurat built from human bones. Where stained glass windows should have been, someone had installed panels of scorched metal that made the whole structure look like the face of a furnace. Each panel was etched with symbols that hurt to study for too long. Geometric patterns that seemed to crawl and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. The symbols were a mixture of different traditions: voodoo waves, Masonic emblems, astrological signs, and others that predated human civilization entirely. A crooked steeple rose from the roof, topped with an iron cross that had been twisted into a shape that resembled a question mark more than a symbol of faith. From somewhere inside that steeple came the sound of wind chimes, though there was no breeze to move them. The sound was discordant and wrong, like broken bells tolling for the damned, and it set my teeth on edge in ways I couldn't explain. I parked my truck at the end of the causeway and walked the rest of the way, my boots splashing through puddles of marsh water that had seeped up between the rotting planks. The water was warm, almost body temperature, and it had an oily quality that made me think of blood thinned with swamp mud. As I got closer to the church, I could see that the front door was standing open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. But it wasn't empty darkness. There was a quality to the shadows within that suggested presence, intelligence, something waiting with infinite patience for visitors to arrive. The air that flowed from the open doorway carried scents that didn't belong in any natural environment. Incense mixed with sulfur, rotting flowers combined with burning metal, the sweet corruption of flesh that's been dead too long. The porch steps groaned under my weight, and I paused at the threshold to pull out my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing pews made from split cypress logs, arranged in neat rows facing an altar constructed from blocks of limestone. The altar was covered in a fine layer of ash that stirred with each breath of wind, and behind it hung a crucifix that had been carved from a single piece of bone. Everything in the church was covered in that same ash, inches deep in some places, as if the building had been snowing soot for decades. My footsteps left clear prints in the grey powder as I made my way down the centre aisle, and I could see other footprints scattered throughout the space. Some looked recent, while others seemed to have been pressed into the ash so long ago that they'd become fossilised. The pews themselves were works of art, each one carved with scenes from biblical stories that had been subtly altered to change their meaning. The Last Supper showed Judas offering the cup to Christ rather than the other way around. The crucifixion depicted Christ with his arms unbound, embracing the cross willingly. The resurrection showed the stone being rolled back from the inside, as if Christ had been trying to get back into the tomb rather than escape from it. I made my way toward the altar, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the walls. The limestone blocks that form the church's foundation were carved with symbols similar to those on the metal window panels, but older, deeper, like they'd been cut into the stone before the building was even constructed. Between the symbols were Latin phrases that I recognized from my years working with the dead. Requiescat in pace, memento mori, vanitas vanitatum. But there were other phrases too, ones that made my skin crawl when I read them. Spes ultima dea, hope is the last goddess. Fide sola damnat, faith alone damns. Veritas in tenebris, truth in darkness. Behind the altar I found what I was looking for. A narrow staircase descending into the earth. The steps were carved directly from the limestone foundation, worn smooth by countless feet, and they led down into absolute darkness. The air rising from below carried the scent of sulphur and old bones, mixed with something else that I couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. I started down the stairs, counting each step as I descended. 27 steps in total, each one taking me deeper into the earth beneath the church. The walls on either side were lined with niches carved into the stone, and in each niche sat a human skull. Not just sitting, but embedded in the masonry, with mortar made from marsh mud and ash. Each skull faced inward, toward the staircase, their empty sockets following my descent with eyeless attention. The temperature dropped noticeably as I went deeper, and I could hear sounds echoing from below that had no business existing in any earthly structure. Whispers in languages I didn't recognize, the distant sound of machinery that seemed to be made from organic materials, and underneath it all, a low humming that felt more like vibration than actual sound. The crypt beneath the church was larger than I'd expected, with corridors branching off in several directions like the spokes of a wheel. The main chamber was circular, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above my flashlight's reach. The walls were completely covered in skulls, hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns that created a mosaic of bone and shadow. But these weren't ordinary skulls. Each one bore evidence of ritual modification, holes drilled in precise patterns, surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Latin verses had been etched into many of them, and my flashlight beam revealed familiar passages from Revelations inscribed in elegant script. Et aperuit puteum abyssi, carved into one skull's forehead, and he opened the bottomless pit, etched across another's cheekbones. Et ascendit fumus putei sicut fumus fornacis magnae, inscribed around the eye sockets of a third, the smoke of the pit ascending like the smoke of a great furnace. As I explored deeper into the tunnels, I began to hear something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Footsteps, echoing from somewhere ahead of me, steady and measured like someone pacing back and forth in meditation. But there was something wrong with the rhythm, something that suggested the walker wasn't entirely human. The sound led me through a maze of bone-lined corridors, past chambers filled with artifacts that defied classification. Altars made from fused human rib cages, candelabras crafted from finger bones that burned with flames that gave off no heat, books bound in skin that had been tattooed with prayers in languages that predated the Tower of Babel. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, and I could hear other sounds mixed in. The rustle of fabric, the creak of old leather, and something that might have been breathing. If breathing could sound like wind through a graveyard. The corridor opened into another circular chamber, this one larger than the first, with alcoves carved into the walls at regular intervals. In each alcove stood what looked like a statue, draped in rotting burial shrouds, and crowned with wreaths of dead flowers. It took me a moment to realize that these weren't statues at all, but mummified corpses preserved by the dry air of the crypt and arranged like saints in a cathedral. But these were Barrowe's original congregation, the 47 souls who died believing they were ascending to heaven. Their bodies had been perfectly preserved, but more than that, they'd been transformed. Their faces wore expressions of beatific peace. Their hands were positioned in prayer, and from each corpse emanated a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with earthly decay. That's where I first laid eyes on Reverend Lucien Barrowe. He stood in the centre of the chamber, his back to me, wearing the rotted remains of a black frock coat that hung in tatters from his skeletal frame. His hair was long and white, hanging down to his shoulders in greasy strands that moved despite the lack of any breeze. When he turned to face me, I saw immediately why no other collector had been able to take him. Barrowe wasn't hiding from Hell's authority because he was afraid. He was hiding because he'd grown beyond the need for it. His skin was the colour and texture of old parchment, stretched tight over prominent cheekbones and a jaw that seemed too wide for any human face. But it was his eyes that truly revealed his nature. They were clouded white, like milk poured into dirty water, yet they tracked my movement with perfect precision and held depths that suggested intelligence vast beyond human comprehension. When he smiled, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had been filed to sharp points, and his gums were black as coal. But, more disturbing than his appearance, was the aura of power that surrounded him, a presence so intense that it made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. "Thaddius Vale," he said, and his voice sounded like wind through a graveyard, like the whisper of dead leaves skittering across stone. But underneath the earthly sounds was something else, harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. "I've been expecting you for quite some time." He began to pace around me in a slow circle, and as he walked, he spoke in a cadence that I recognized as the rhythm of a Sunday sermon. But the words that came from his mouth were scripture quoted backward, familiar verses twisted into blasphemous inversions that made my soul recoil in ways that I hadn't felt since my first collection 40 years ago. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit nothing," he intoned, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you burdens beyond imagining. For my yoke is heavy and my burden is grievous, and ye shall find no rest for your souls." As he spoke, the mummified corpses in the alcoves began to stir. Their burial shrouds rustled like autumn leaves, and I could see movement beneath the rotting fabric. Fingers twitched, heads turned, and eye sockets that should have been empty began to glow with a cold, phosphorescent light that cast dancing shadows on the bone-covered walls. "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Vale?" Barrowe continued, his pacing never faltering. "Do you understand what you've walked into?" I reached into my coat and drew out the soul chain, letting it uncoil in my hand. The meteorite iron was cold as winter, and it seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight rather than reflecting it. The skull-shaped links clicked together softly, making a sound like wind chimes made from bone. But as soon as the chain was fully extended, I felt something that had never happened in 40 years of collections. The meteorite iron began to vibrate, not with its usual eager hunger for soul energy, but with something that felt almost like fear. Barrowe stopped his pacing and smiled wider, revealing more of those filed teeth. "Do you think your devil's trinket will work on me, boy? Do you imagine that 40 years of collecting drunks and murderers has prepared you for this moment?" He spread his arms wide, and I could see that his fingers ended in claws like rusted iron nails. "This place is a crossroads gate, built on bones older than your master's memory. Sacred ground blessed by blood sacrifice and innocent faith. Different rules apply here, rules that predate your devil's authority." I lunged forward and tried to wrap the chain around his chest, But the moment the meteorite iron touched his flesh, something extraordinary happened. The chain didn't burn me as I'd expected. Instead, it began to glow with an inner fire, and I could feel power flowing through it in the wrong direction. Barrowe wasn't being bound by the chain, he was feeding on it. The false preacher's laughter filled the chamber, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of the damned. Did you think it would be that easy? I've had over a century to prepare for this moment, Mr. Vale. This church, these bones, this sacred ground tainted with innocent blood, it's all been arranged for this confrontation. As he spoke, I began to hear other sounds echoing through the tunnels around us. Footsteps, dozens of them, shuffling and scraping against the stone floor. They were coming from multiple directions, growing louder with each passing second, accompanied by voices singing hymns in harmonies that human throats were never meant to produce. My congregation returns every Sunday at midnight, Barrowe said, his clouded eyes gleaming with malevolent joy. They've been waiting so patiently for another revival meeting, another chance to worship at the altar of true faith. And tonight, you're going to help me complete the work I started over a century ago. The first of them appeared at the tunnel entrances, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. They were the burned remains of Barrowe's original followers, but they weren't the shambling corpses I'd expected. These were souls that had been transformed by their false prophet's power, elevated beyond mere undeath into something that approximated divine radiance. Their flesh had been charred black by the church fire, their clothing fused to their skin in patches of melted fabric and bone. Their eye sockets were empty of everything but shadows, yet they moved with purpose and grace that spoke of intelligence beyond the grave. But clutched in their skeletal hands were the same hymnals they'd been holding when they died. The leather covers burned and cracked, but somehow still intact. The pages were yellow with age and stained with substances that might have been blood or communion wine, or both, and the text written on those pages glowed with the same phosphorescent light that emanated from their empty eye sockets. They filed into the chamber with synchronized movements, taking positions in rows, as if the curved walls were pews in their phantom church. Their movements were choreographed, practiced, like a dance they'd been rehearsing for over a century. When they opened their mouths to sing, the sound that emerged was both beautiful and terrible. It was Amazing Grace played backward, the familiar melody inverted into something that spoke of damnation rather than salvation. But this wasn't the crude reversal I'd heard from other corrupted spirits. This was a masterpiece of musical theology, a hymn that maintained all the emotional power of the original while leading the soul in the opposite direction. Ikag gnizama, tius wu dinuos, tat devas a aktirv ekilem. As they sang, the temperature in the chamber began to rise. The stone walls grew warm to the touch, and I could smell sulphur in the air, thick and choking like the breath of a forge. Above us, I heard a grinding sound like massive gears turning, and chunks of limestone began to fall from the ceiling. But this wasn't the collapse I'd experienced in the cemetery 40 years ago. This was something far more controlled, far more intentional. The ceiling was opening like the petals of some enormous flower, revealing not the night sky above, but a vista that defied comprehension. Through the widening aperture, I could see the infrastructure of hell itself, not the crude medieval nightmare of popular imagination, but something far more complex and beautiful and terrible. Vast machines made from crystallized suffering ground away at the fabric of reality, powered by engines that burned with the light of fallen stars. Corridors carved from living bone stretched away into infinity, filled with souls that had been transformed into components of some incomprehensible design. And at the center of it all, seated on a throne, made from the compressed prayers of the damned, was my master. But he wasn't the refined southern gentleman I'd known for 40 years. He was something vast and multidimensional, a presence that existed across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. The floor beneath my feet started to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward from the center of the chamber like a spider's web. But instead of revealing the hellish pit I'd expected, the gaps showed glimpses of something else entirely. Fields of golden wheat stretching to horizons that curved upward instead of away. Cities of crystal and light where beings of pure energy danced in celebration of existence itself. Gardens where every flower sang hymns of joy that made the soul weep with happiness. "Welcome to the truth of things, Mr. Vale," Barrowe said, his voice now harmonizing with the backward hymns of his congregation. "Welcome to the revelation that your master has spent eons trying to hide." I stared through the cracks in the floor, trying to understand what I was seeing. "What is this place?" "This is heaven," Barrowe replied, gesturing toward the impossible landscape below. "The real heaven, not the pale reflection that religions preach about. The place where souls go when they die, in a state of genuine grace, untainted by the lies and corruptions that your master has woven into every earthly faith." The truth hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, the soul chain falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone floor. "You're telling me that hell has been intercepting souls that were meant for heaven?" "Not intercepting," Barrowe corrected. "Creating. Your master doesn't just collect souls that are already damned. He manufactures damnation through false religions, corrupted faiths, and teachings designed to make believers vulnerable to spiritual predation." He gestured to his congregation, their backward hymns growing stronger and more complex. These 47 souls died believing they were going to heaven, and they were right. Their faith was pure, their love genuine, their sacrifice complete. But because they worshipped in a church built on a crossroads gate, because they trusted a preacher who was actually a demon in disguise, their souls were diverted into hell's collection system. The implications were staggering. Every soul I'd collected over the past 40 years, every name in my ledger, every chain-wrapped sinner I'd delivered to the crossroads gates, had they all been destined for something better? "But they were murderers," I protested. "Thieves, corrupt politicians, fallen priests. They were genuine sinners." "Sinners manufactured by a system designed to produce sin," Barrowe replied. "Your master's agents have been working within human institutions for millennia, corrupting governments to create injustice, undermining economies to breed desperation, infiltrating religions to replace divine truth with spiritual poison." He pointed to the vision of hell visible through the open ceiling. "Look closely at those machines, Mr. Vale. What do you think they're really producing?" I stared upward, focusing on the vast mechanisms that ground away at reality itself. At first, I saw only the processing of souls, the conversion of spiritual energy into some form of fuel. But as I watched more carefully, I began to see the output of those machines flowing through conduits that led back toward the mortal world. "Influence," I whispered. "They're producing influence. Despair, hatred, greed, pride, all the spiritual poisons that make souls vulnerable to collection," Barrowe confirmed. "Hell doesn't just punish sin, it creates sin. Your master has built a closed-loop system that manufactures its own raw materials." The congregation's backward hymns reached a crescendo, and through the cracks in the floor, I could see figures moving in the fields of heaven below. Souls in their true forms, beings of light and music and perfect love, going about their eternal work of creation and celebration. Among them, I recognized faces from the photographs in my collection files. People I believed were damned were actually living in paradise, their true selves revealed and glorified. "Then why are you here?" I asked. "If you know the truth, if you have the power to resist collection, why haven't you exposed this system?" Barrowe's expression grew sad, and for a moment the ancient power surrounding him flickered, revealing something achingly human beneath the demonic facade. "Because I'm not who you think I am," he said. "I'm not a rogue demon who stole souls from Hell's collection system. I'm what's left of a human preacher who tried to save his congregation from a trap he didn't understand until it was too late." The revelation hit me like cold water. "You're the real Lucien Barrowe." "I was," he said, "a genuine man of God who thought he could build a sanctuary on holy ground, who believed that pure faith would be enough to protect innocent souls from spiritual predators. I was wrong." He gestured to the mummified forms of his congregation, their phosphorescent glow pulsing in rhythm with their backward hymns. "When Hell's agents came for my people, I made a choice. I bound their souls to mine using forbidden rituals, keeping them safe from collection by absorbing them into my own spiritual essence. The cost was my humanity, my sanity, and my hope of ever seeing heaven myself. But the poison, the mass suicide, a lie created by Hell's propaganda department to discredit what really happened here," Barrowe said. "My congregation didn't die from strychnine. They died defending this sacred ground from demonic assault, and their sacrifice gave me the power to protect their souls from collection." I looked around the chamber at the glowing forms of his congregation, understanding finally dawning. They're not trapped here. They're choosing to stay. "They're waiting," Barrowe corrected. "Waiting for someone with the authority to challenge Hell's collection system. Someone who could take the truth back to the mortal world and expose the conspiracy that's been damning innocent souls for millennia." The weight of what he was suggesting settled on me like a physical burden. "You want me to betray my master?" "I want you to serve your true master," Barrowe said. "The same one I served before I was forced to become a monster to protect the innocent. The God who created souls to know love and joy, not to fuel machines built from crystallized suffering." Through the open ceiling, I could see movement in Hell's vast machinery. My master's attention had been drawn to our confrontation, and I could feel his presence pressing down on the chamber like a weight that threatened to crush everything beneath it. "He's coming," I said. "Yes," Barrowe agreed. "And when he arrives, you'll have to choose. Continue serving a system that manufactures damnation for profit, or help me break the cycle that's been condemning innocent souls for thousands of years." The congregation's backward hymns grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel power building in the chamber like pressure before a storm. The cracks in the floor widened, revealing more of heaven's impossible landscape below, while the aperture in the ceiling showed Hell's machinery grinding to a halt as my master prepared to intervene directly. "What would you have me do?" I asked. Barrowe smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, the expression held genuine warmth. "The same thing you've been doing for 40 years, Mr. Vale. Collect a soul. But this time, collect the right one." Before I could ask what he meant, the chamber filled with a presence so vast and terrible that reality itself seemed to buckle under the strain. My master materialized in the center of the room, but not in the refined human form I'd known for decades. This was his true shape, a being of shadow and flame and crystallized malice that towered above us like a mountain of concentrated evil. "Enough," he said, and his voice was the sound of reality tearing like fabric. "You have seen quite enough, Reverend Vale." The false vision of heaven visible through the floor cracks flickered and disappeared, replaced by the familiar red glow of molten sulfur and burning souls. The backward hymns of Barrowe's congregation became screams of torment, and their phosphorescent glow transformed into the hellish radiance of spiritual combustion. "Did you really think I would allow you to see behind the curtain?" my master continued, his form solidifying into something closer to human proportions. "Did you imagine that I hadn't planned for this eventuality?" Barrowe's expression changed from hope to horror, as the power he'd accumulated over a century began to drain away like water through a sieve. His congregation's mummified forms crumbled to ash, and the protective wards he'd built into the church's structure failed one by one. "The vision you saw was a lie," my master said, his voice returning to the honey-smooth drawl I remembered. "A sophisticated illusion designed to test your loyalty, Mr. Vale. Barrowe here has been working for me all along, playing the role of tempter to identify agents who might be susceptible to rebellion." I looked from my master to Barrowe, trying to understand which version of the truth was real. The false preacher's ancient face was contorted with rage and despair, but was it the fury of a fallen angel being exposed, or the anguish of a true servant of God watching his last hope die? "Then why bring me here?" I asked. "Why this elaborate charade?" "Because your contract is complete," my master replied. 100 souls collected and delivered as agreed. But superior performance deserves recognition, and I have a proposition for you." He gestured towards the collapsing chamber around us, where the limestone walls were beginning to weep blood, and the air itself was catching fire. "Lucien Barrowe represents the completion of a project that began over a century ago," he said. "The creation of a perfect lure for souls who might otherwise escape collection. A false prophet who offers genuine hope, real salvation, true redemption, right up until the moment of final betrayal." The truth was more horrible than either version I'd been offered. Barrowe wasn't a rogue demon or a fallen preacher. He was a puppet, a construct built from the spiritual remains of a genuinely holy man, and animated by hell's will to serve as the ultimate trap for pure souls. "His congregation didn't die defending sacred ground," my master continued. "They died because they believed in something that was real enough to fool even them. Barrowe's faith, his love, his genuine desire to protect innocent souls. All of it was real, and that's what made him such an effective hunter." I watched Barrowe's form continue to deteriorate, the ancient power that had sustained him for over a century finally failing, but his eyes remained fixed on mine, and in them I saw something that my master's explanation couldn't account for. I saw the recognition of a fellow prisoner. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. "Take his place," my master said. "Become the new lure for souls who are too pure for conventional collection methods. With your 40 years of experience and perfect record, you could be even more effective than Barrowe was." The offer hung in the air between us like a poisoned chalice. Accept, and I would spend eternity pretending to offer salvation while actually delivering souls to damnation. Refuse, and I would likely share Barrowe's fate, whatever that might be. "And if I decline?" My master's smile revealed those tombstone white teeth. "Then you'll discover that your contract contains certain fine print that you may not have noticed. Clause 777 states that upon completion of the 100-soul collection, the contractor's own soul becomes property of hell unless they accept a position within the organization." The chain of meteorite iron at my feet began to glow with malevolent energy, and I realized that it had never been just a tool for binding other souls. It had been a leash, connecting me to hell's authority, marking me as property to be claimed when my usefulness as a free agent came to an end. But something about Barrowe's expression suggested that not all hope was lost. As his physical form continued to crumble, he mouthed a single word that my master couldn't hear. "Choose." The chamber around us was collapsing completely now, the limestone walls cracking and bleeding, the ceiling falling in chunks that burst into flame before they hit the floor. Through the chaos, I could see the soul chain writhing like a living thing, reaching toward me with hungry intent. And in that moment of absolute crisis, I finally understood what Barrowe had been trying to tell me. I had a choice to make, but it wasn't the one my master thought he was offering. It wasn't between serving hell willingly or being dragged into service against my will. It was between perpetuating a system built on lies or risking everything to serve something greater. I picked up the soul chain, feeling its weight in my hands one last time. The meteorite iron was warm now, pulsing with anticipation of the binding that would make me Hell's property forever. Then I wrapped it around my own chest. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Instead of binding my soul to Hell's service, the chain began to unravel the connection that had tied me to my master's will for 40 years. Every soul I'd ever collected, every name in my ledger, every act of spiritual violence I committed, all of it flowed backward through the meteorite iron, returning to its source. My master's roar of rage shook the foundations of reality itself, but he was too late to stop what I'd set in motion. The chain was designed to work in only one direction, and once the process began, even he couldn't reverse it. "You fool," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I felt the binding around my soul crack and shatter, 40 years of spiritual debt dissolving like salt in rain. But more than that, I could feel the souls I'd collected being released from Hell's custody, their true destinations finally revealed. Some went to heaven, their genuine faith vindicated at last. Others simply ceased to exist, finding peace in oblivion after lives of undeserved suffering. A few chose to remain as they were, accepting their fate in Hell's machinery as the price of choices freely made. But all of them, every single one, were finally free to choose their own destiny. The collapsing chamber around us began to stabilize as Hell's hold on this place weakened. The bleeding walls sealed themselves, the falling ceiling reformed, and the phosphorescent glow of genuine sanctity began to emanate from the bone-covered walls. Barrowe's crumbling form solidified, his ancient features regaining some of their humanity as the puppet strings that had controlled him for over a century finally snapped. "Impossible," my master whispered, his voice losing its honey-smooth confidence. For the first time in our 4-decade association, the chain was forged to be unbreakable. No soul bound by meteorite iron has ever escaped collection. No soul bound by meteorite iron and faith in your authority, I corrected, but I stopped having faith in you the moment I saw what you'd done to him. I gestured toward Barrowe, who was struggling to his feet with movements that grew more human with each passing second. "You made a mistake," I continued. "You let me see the truth of what this place really was, and in doing so, you gave me something more powerful than any tool you could forge." "And what was that?" "A choice that actually mattered." The chamber around us continued to transform. Hell's influences being purged by energies that came from sources far older and more powerful than demonic authority. The skull-lined walls began to glow with warm light, and the air filled with the sound of singing. Not the backward hymns of corrupted souls, but the genuine praise of spirits, freed from bondage. My master's form began to waver as his hold on this crossroads gate weakened beyond repair. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "Hell's infrastructure spans dimensions. The collection system will continue without you, without this place, without any of it. New collectors will be recruited, new lures will be created, new methods will be developed." Perhaps, I agreed, but now there's also something else, a place where souls can come to learn the truth, to understand the choice they're really being offered. A sanctuary where genuine faith can be distinguished from manufactured corruption. Barrowe stepped forward, his voice human again for the first time in over a century. "A resistance," he said, "a place where the real war for souls can finally begin." My master's laughter was like the sound of reality breaking. "A resistance? You think the two of you can challenge an infrastructure that's been building for millennia? You're delusional." "Not just the two of us," I said, feeling the presence of others joining us in the transformed chamber. The souls I'd released from Hell's custody. The ones who'd chosen to continue fighting rather than accept their final rest. The genuine martyrs and saints who'd been trapped in demonic machinery for for centuries waiting for someone to show them a way out. And behind them, others were coming. Souls who'd been pretending to serve hell, while secretly working to undermine its authority. Angels who'd been thought lost but had actually been operating deep undercover within the enemy's ranks. Even some demons who'd grown tired of the eternal cycle of suffering and were ready to consider alternatives. "You started this war long before I was born," I told my former master. "You created the conditions that make damnation seem inevitable, that turn faith into a weapon against the faithful. But you made one critical error in your design." "And what was that?" "You gave souls the ability to choose love over fear, hope over despair, truth over comfortable lies. And as long as that choice exists, your system will never be perfect. There will always be cracks for the light to shine through." With a final roar of frustrated rage, my master's form dissolved into shadow and flame, retreating back to the hellish infrastructure visible through the aperture in the ceiling. But as he departed, his voice echoed through the chamber one last time. "This isn't over, Vale. Hell's collection will continue, and we will adapt to counter whatever resistance you think you can build. The war for souls is eternal, and we have resources you can't imagine." The aperture closed with a sound like thunder, sealing Hell's direct access to this crossroads gate. But I knew my former master was right about one thing. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Barrowe and I stood in the transformed chamber, surrounded by the glowing forms of liberated souls and the remnants of his congregation, who had chosen to remain and help build whatever came next. "So what now?" I asked. Barrowe smiled, and for the first time in our acquaintance, the expression held genuine peace. "Now we do what we've always done," he said. "We minister to souls in need, offer guidance to the lost, and provide hope to those who despair. The only difference is that this time we'll be telling them the truth." He gestured towards the bone-lined walls, which were already beginning to transform into something more welcoming. "This place will become what I always intended it to be, a true sanctuary, a place where souls can come to understand their real options and make genuine choices about their eternal destiny." "And the collection system, Hell's infrastructure?" "Will continue to operate," Barrowe admitted, "but now there's an alternative, a place where souls can come to learn the difference between authentic faith and manufactured corruption, between genuine redemption and spiritual predation." I looked down at the meteorite iron chain, which had crumbled to dust when it completed its work of liberation. For 40 years, it had been my tool for binding souls to damnation. Now it was nothing but ash, its purpose fulfilled, in a way its creators never intended. "Will others come?" I asked. "Other collectors, other agents of Hell's authority?" "They'll try," Barrowe said, "but this place is protected now by something stronger than any ward or barrier Hell could create. It's protected by the truth and by the free choice of souls who've decided to serve love instead of fear." Over the following hours, as the church above us rebuilt itself into something that reflected its true purpose, we began to understand the scope of what we'd undertaken. The resistance against Hell's collection system would require more than just sanctuary and truth-telling. It would require active intervention in the systems that manufactured spiritual corruption, work to expose and counter the agents who infiltrated human institutions, and the creation of networks that could help genuine faith distinguish itself from demonic mimicry. But for the first time in 40 years, I felt like I was doing work that mattered for reasons I could understand and support. Instead of binding souls to damnation, I would be helping them find their way to whatever form of salvation they were truly meant to discover. The ledger that had recorded my collections for 4 decades transformed as well, its pages now blank and ready to record a different kind of work. Not the names of the damned, but the stories of the liberated. Not a catalogue of spiritual theft, but a testament to the power of genuine choice. And sometimes late at night, when the transformed church fills with the songs of free souls, and the air itself glows with the light of authentic hope. I remember my former master's parting words about adaptation and resources and eternal war. He was right, of course. Hell's collection system continues to operate, probably with modifications designed to counter the resistance we've built. New lures are created, new methods developed, new ways found to make damnation seem like salvation. But he was also wrong about something crucial. The war for souls isn't eternal because hell makes it so. It's eternal because love makes it so, because the impulse to protect and nurture and guide souls toward their true destiny is stronger than any system designed to exploit and corrupt and consume. And as long as that love exists, as long as souls retain the ability to choose truth over lies and hope over despair, there will always be resistance. There will always be sanctuaries where genuine faith can distinguish itself from spiritual poison. There will always be light shining through the cracks. The bell in our transformed steeple tolls every Sunday at midnight now. Not to call the faithful to deception, but to remind all souls, living and dead, bound and free, lost and found, that there are choices in this universe that no authority can take away. The collection continues, but now it serves a different master. Now it serves love.